Welcome, Chosen X. You did not arrive at this moment by coincidence. Something within you slowed before your eyes finished moving across the first line. A subtle recognition passed through your body, quiet yet undeniable, as if a deeper layer of awareness had been waiting for this exact signal. Lately, you have carried a pressure that never announced itself loudly. It did not crash into you or demand panic. It lingered instead, resting behind your thoughts, following you through ordinary days with unfamiliar weight. You tried to explain it away. You labeled it fatigue. You blamed routines, schedules, obligations that never seemed to loosen their grip. You told yourself this heaviness was temporary, another phase that would dissolve if you pushed harder or rested longer. Yet even as you repeated those explanations, part of you knew they were incomplete. The sensation did not behave like exhaustion. It behaved like displacement. Something inside you was shifting while the outer structures of your life remained unchanged. Moments that once felt neutral began to carry tension. Choices that used to feel automatic started leaving residue. You noticed it in the quiet after conversations, in the way familiar environments no longer settled you the way they once did. There was no single event to point to. No visible fracture. Just a growing awareness that your inner world was reorganizing itself without asking permission. This was not confusion. It was friction. A friction formed between who you had been conditioned to remain and who you were no longer able to perform as convincingly. That tension pressed against you from the inside, demanding attention without offering instructions. You felt it when comfort arrived with an unspoken cost. You felt it when repetition stopped feeling safe and started feeling small. You sensed that something old had been stirred, not as a threat but as a test. An influence that does not rush, does not shout, does not force its way forward. It waits patiently for people to grow tired, to soften their boundaries, to confuse relief with truth. It thrives where longing replaces clarity and where intensity pretends to be meaning. You did not see this influence clearly yet. You only felt its proximity in patterns you had visited before. Emotional landscapes that promised familiarity while quietly draining your center. Connections that arrived quickly and faded slowly, leaving you to interpret the emptiness as your own failure. Each return reinforced the belief that this was simply how life moved through you. Still, something had begun to resist. Not with strength, not with defiance, but with awareness. You started noticing how often you adjusted yourself to remain welcome. How often you earned what should never have required payment. You recognized the quiet pride you once felt for enduring situations that asked you to disappear in small increments. That recognition did not liberate you instantly. It unsettled you. It introduced pauses where reflex used to live. You began to hesitate before repeating choices that once felt inevitable. Those hesitations were brief, almost unnoticeable, yet they carried weight. They marked the first moments where your attention returned inward instead of reaching outward for permission. You are standing at the threshold of that awareness now. Not because you fought for it, but because you stayed present long enough to feel what repetition was costing you. This is not the beginning of action. It is the beginning of sight. And once something is seen clearly, it does not return to obscurity easily. Nothing has been demanded of you yet. No vow. No confrontation. Only honesty. The kind that settles quietly and refuses to leave. Whatever follows will build from this moment, from this pause, from the subtle understanding that the center of your life has not been occupied as carefully as it deserved to be. This is where the movement begins. You may feel tempted to rush past this sensation, to look for immediate resolution or clear instruction. Resist that impulse. What is forming here requires space rather than speed. Awareness grows roots before it shows branches. The pressure you sensed was not a warning but an invitation to notice where your energy has been going and why it has not been returning. This moment asks you to remain rather than react, to observe rather than explain. As you linger here, you may realize that much of your strength has been spent maintaining familiar rhythms. Patterns disguise themselves as choices, and choices harden into habits that shaped your days without consulting your deeper needs. Seeing this is uncomfortable, yet it carries relief. It confirms that what you felt was real, not imagined, not weakness, but information arriving through sensation instead of language. This threshold does not promise comfort. It offers clarity. And clarity changes the direction of everything that follows. Stay with it. The next turn is near. You remain where most people would have retreated. The quiet that followed the first recognition did not rush to comfort you, and it did not punish you either. It simply stayed. Within that stillness, something began to arrange itself with unsettling precision. You started to notice the architecture of your own repetition, not as memory, but as structure. Certain emotional routes revealed themselves as well-worn paths rather than spontaneous discoveries. You saw how often your days curved back toward the same internal rooms. Each room felt different on the surface, yet the air inside them carried a familiar density. Attention arrived quickly there. Meaning was promised. Relief seemed possible. Yet each visit ended the same way, with you leaving pieces of yourself behind and calling the loss maturity. You had believed these returns were evidence of depth, of loyalty, of patience. Now they appeared more like rehearsed movements performed without conscious command. This was when you understood that repetition does not require force to survive. It only requires familiarity. The mind mistakes what it recognizes for what it needs. Desire becomes persuasive when it borrows the voice of memory. You began to trace how certain emotions surfaced together, how longing invited intensity, how intensity disguised itself as truth. None of this was dramatic. It was efficient. The system had been functioning smoothly for a long time. You noticed how quickly you justified the drain. You told yourself that connection always demands sacrifice. You believed that discomfort was the toll paid for closeness. Over time, that belief shaped your standards. You measured worth through endurance and confused availability with care. These ideas were never forced upon you. You accepted them gradually, decision by decision, each one small enough to ignore. As this awareness sharpened, a presence became clearer. Not a creature, not a voice, but a pattern that learned how you responded. It observed where your attention softened, where silence unsettled you, where recognition felt urgent. It did not chase you. It waited for you to arrive on your own. That patience was its greatest advantage. When people return willingly, no resistance is required. You realized how this presence relied on your interpretation rather than your consent. It thrived when you mistook intensity for alignment. It gained influence when chemistry replaced clarity. It never invented wounds. It simply revisited the ones that had not healed and suggested they were proof of depth. Each suggestion sounded reasonable. Each choice felt personal. That was the illusion that kept the structure intact. The more you watched, the more precise the pattern became. You saw how hope functioned without boundaries. How explanations replaced action. How understanding others became a way to postpone honoring yourself. You had believed that patience would eventually transform outcomes. Instead, it prolonged cycles that fed on your availability. Every return strengthened the idea that familiarity equaled destiny. This recognition did not feel empowering. It felt sobering. The realization that so much of your emotional movement had been predictable introduced a new kind of fatigue. Not the tiredness that asks for rest, but the exhaustion that refuses to continue surrendering without awareness. You sensed that the pattern depended on momentum. As long as you moved automatically, it remained intact. The shift occurred when you stopped narrating your experiences and started feeling their cost. Conversations that once energized you now left you hollow. Comfort began to feel conditional. Familiarity tightened rather than soothed. These sensations carried information you had previously overridden with logic. Now you listened. Listening changed the tempo. The pattern did not disappear, but it slowed. You could see the sequence forming before it completed itself. That visibility altered your position. You were no longer inside the movement. You were adjacent to it. The presence that once relied on your reflexes began to lose certainty. It adjusted by offering nostalgia, by softening its approach, by reminding you of moments when returning felt easier than staying present. You did not reject those memories. You observed them. Observation diluted their authority. The system that once operated quietly began to reveal its mechanics. Once revealed, it could no longer pretend to be fate. It was a design sustained by repetition, not an inevitability imposed from beyond you. You are still within reach of that structure, but you are no longer blind to it. Awareness has introduced friction where ease once lived. This friction is not meant to punish you. It is meant to interrupt momentum. The moment you see how something works, it can no longer claim mystery. And when mystery fades, power starts to relocate. This part of the journey is not dramatic. It is methodical. You are not being asked to leave yet. You are being asked to see how often you return and why. That understanding is preparing you for the next shift, where reaction will give way to position and the center you once abandoned will begin to fill again. The moment arrived without ceremony. No signal announced it, no external force marked its importance. You found yourself standing in a situation you recognized instantly, an intersection you had crossed many times before. The setting was familiar, the emotional tone predictable, the invitation subtle yet persuasive. In the past, your body would have moved before your thoughts could intervene. This time, something else happened. You did not advance. You did not retreat. You paused. That pause was not hesitation born of fear. It carried none of the anxious urgency you once mistook for intuition. It felt grounded, almost weighty, as if gravity had shifted inward. For the first time, desire rose inside you without seizing control. You felt its warmth, its pull, its promise, yet it did not command your movement. It passed through awareness rather than hijacking it. This stillness surprised you. It revealed how rarely you had allowed sensation to exist without translating it into action. Previously, every internal spark demanded response. Now, you stayed present long enough to notice its full arc. You watched the impulse rise, peak, and soften without interference. That observation changed the equation. What once felt compulsory began to look optional. Something structural adjusted within you during that pause. A space you had never occupied consciously began to fill. Not with ego, not with resolve, but with position. It felt as though an internal seat long left vacant was finally claimed. From there, you could see without scrambling, choose without defending, remain without effort. The presence that had relied on your predictability sensed the shift immediately. Its influence depended on rhythm, on your reliable return to familiar responses. When that rhythm broke, uncertainty entered its calculations. It attempted to re-establish momentum by changing tactics. Urgency softened into suggestion. Intensity was replaced by memory. Images surfaced that once persuaded you effortlessly. You felt the pull of those memories. You did not deny them. You allowed them to surface fully without obeying their implication. This neutrality disrupted the mechanism more than resistance ever could. The system feeding on your reaction could not interpret stillness. Without escalation, it lost traction. You noticed how your body responded differently than before. The familiar tightening did not arrive. Your breath remained steady. Sensation moved without demanding resolution. This was unfamiliar territory. You had associated intensity with importance for so long that calm felt suspicious. Yet the steadiness did not collapse. It was held. In that holding, authority relocated. Not outward, not upward, but inward. You did not announce this shift to yourself. You did not label it growth or strength. You simply remained aligned with it. That alignment carried clarity without commentary. It required no reinforcement. The presence attempted one final access point, drawing on guilt and doubt. It suggested that restraint would lead to regret, that silence meant loss, that staying centered was a form of withdrawal. These narratives had once governed your choices. Now you examine them rather than absorbing them. The examination dissolved their urgency. Without urgency, they faded. This was the fracture point. Not dramatic, not visible, but decisive. You felt it as cleanliness, as a return of energy that had been scattered for years. The absence of internal negotiation created space. In that space, attention returned to you rather than reaching outward for validation. What weakened the influence was not defiance but irrelevance. When you stopped engaging, the exchange ended. Predictability had been its leverage. Uncertainty became yours. That reversal did not produce euphoria. It produced quiet. Many retreat at this stage, unsettled by the unfamiliar absence of noise. You did not. You stayed with the silence long enough to recognize it was not empty. It was occupied by something stable. Something that did not fluctuate with desire or recoil from discomfort. This stability did not promise ease. It promised orientation. From this position, you could sense how much of your past movement had been reactive. Seeing that clearly created distance without judgment. Distance weakened influence. The structure that once governed your responses no longer had immediate access. You were still near the pattern, but you were no longer inside it. Awareness had shifted from observation to embodiment. The center you once abandoned was no longer vacant. It was held. And once held, it does not release itself easily. This was not an ending. It was a relocation. The axis of your life had moved, quietly, decisively, and without announcement. The quiet that followed did not rush to reward you. It did not rush to explain itself either. It settled in slowly, reshaping the internal landscape without asking for approval. Where turbulence once dominated, there was now space. Not absence, but room. Room to notice how your attention moved, how your energy responded, how your body signaled truth long before language formed. This stage felt unfamiliar not because peace was new to you, but because peace had never remained without being interrupted by habit. In the past, calm had always been temporary, something to enjoy briefly before returning to motion. Now it stayed. That persistence unsettled you more than chaos ever had. You realized how deeply you had been conditioned to equate movement with meaning. The influence that once guided you did not vanish. It adapted. It no longer approached intensity or urgency. Instead, it leaned on routine. It relied on the assumption that patterns eventually resume, that clarity fades, that people drift back into old arrangements when vigilance softens. It waited for doubt to re-enter through familiarity. Loneliness surfaced during this period, but it arrived differently than before. It did not accuse you. It did not demand escape. It existed as a neutral presence, an open field rather than a closed wound. You felt it fully without translating it into self-judgment. That choice altered its nature. Loneliness no longer implied lack. It signaled capacity. You noticed how your environment responded to your shift. Some connections grew quiet. Others felt strained by your steadiness. Situations that once pulled you inward now paused, as if waiting for permission. You were not performing at a distance. You were inhabiting a position. That difference mattered. People who had relied on your reaction felt disoriented by your composure. The inner structure continued to stabilize. Decisions required less debate. Thoughts moved without spiraling. When discomfort appeared, it did not escalate into urgency. You could hold it without betraying yourself. This capacity changed your relationship with challenges. Difficulty no longer demanded immediate resolution. It invited discernment. The presence attempted to return through subtle persuasion. It suggested that standing alone meant error, that coherence would isolate you, that belonging required compromise of your center. These ideas had once governed your fear of separation. Now you examine them with clarity. You felt the pull of community without surrendering authority. You understood that a connection built on self-abandonment was not a connection at all. This was the phase where many confuse quiet with emptiness and retreat out of habit. You did not. You stayed long enough to recognize the difference. The silence was not hollow. It was inhabited. Something within you had taken a seat, not loudly, not defensively, but with certainty. Authority does not announce itself. It remains. From this position, you could see how much of your past had been shaped by reaction rather than choice. That recognition did not produce shame. It produced perspective. Perspective created distance. Distance weakened influence. The structure that once depended on fragmentation could not operate within coherence. The influence sensed its reach shortening. It had relied on vacancy, in the absence of a settled center. Now that absence was gone. The inner order did not collapse dramatically. It reorganized quietly. The throne once occupied by external validation was replaced by self-recognition. You no longer needed intensity to feel alive. You no longer needed to be claimed to feel real. This rearrangement altered your internal hierarchy. Desire still moved through you, but it no longer dictated direction. Memory still surfaced, but it no longer commanded return. The stories that once persuaded you lost coherence. They passed through awareness and dissolved. What remained was alignment. You did not celebrate this shift. You respected it. You understood that stability requires maintenance. Attention became something you tended rather than spent. You noticed where your energy moved and guided it back without force. This was not a defense. It was care. The influence did not retreat through defeat. It receded through irrelevance. It could not negotiate with steadiness. When it realized you were no longer visiting this state but living within it, its position changed. It could not remove what had been established. It could only acknowledge the permanence of your presence. You felt this acknowledgement as orientation. The internal order had been restored. And once restored, it does not revert easily. This was not the end of the journey. It was the moment responsibility began to replace resistance. What you carried now was not immunity, but clarity. And clarity demands stewardship. What comes after alignment is not relief. It is orientation. The absence of inner conflict does not signal rest, it signals responsibility. You feel this shift immediately, not as pressure, but as precision. Your attention moves differently now. Where it once scattered outward, it gathers. Where it once reacted, it selects. This change does not announce itself to others, yet everything around you responds. Life does not stop offering invitations. Desire still circulates. Memory still surfaces. Comfort still presents itself with familiar timing. The difference is position. You are no longer inside the current being carried by momentum. You stand at the edge watching it pass, aware of its direction, aware of its cost. That awareness alters the exchange before it begins. This stage does not test your ability to escape old patterns. It tests your capacity to lead yourself without returning to them. The challenges are quieter now. No dramatic collapses. No obvious consequences. Instead, subtle assessments appear. Familiarity asks you to relax your standards. Opportunity asks you to forget what you have learned. Ease asks you to trade coherence for convenience. These moments arrive gently. They require discernment rather than strength. You notice how your body responds before your mind assembles a story. Tension signals misalignment earlier than it used to. Calm arrives without justification. Intuition speaks softly and sooner. You listen. Listening becomes your primary discipline. You understand now that force was never required. Attention was. The influence that once occupied your center has not vanished from the world. It simply no longer governs you. Its reach ends where coherence begins. It understands hunger and urgency. It does not understand steadiness. When a person stops oscillating between desire and regret, its language loses effect. Suggestion dissolves in the presence of clarity. Your environment reflects this change. Situations that once demanded reaction now wait. Some relationships adjust. Others fall silent. You do not chase explanations. You allow alignment to rearrange what no longer fits. This is not withdrawal. It is accurate. Precision feels cold to those who relied on your availability. You accept that without apology. With clarity comes stewardship. You tend your inner order the way one maintains a structure meant to last. You notice where your energy moves. You return it without struggle. You recognize that authority is not control, but consistency. Consistency builds trust within yourself. That trust stabilizes choice. You begin to understand why chaos once taught you through impact. You needed intensity to hear. Now instruction arrives quietly. Meaning replaces reaction. Discernment replaces urgency. Choice replaces compulsion. This is not an easier path. It is a cleaner one. Responsibility increases as clarity stabilizes. You may feel the impulse to conclude, to label this as an ending. It is not. It is a transition into continuity. What has been activated here was never meant to remain confined to words on a screen. It moves. It evolves. It asks to be lived in sequence rather than consumed in fragments. When the image appears at the center of your screen, it is not interrupted. It is the next expression of the same current, carried through voice and presence instead of text. The resonance you feel is recognition, not persuasion. Staying connected is not an agreement. It is continuity. It allows what is aligned within you to deepen rather than disperse. Choosing to remain present through that channel is an extension of the same clarity you have cultivated here. Subscribing and allowing notifications is not a transaction. It is a commitment to follow coherence as it unfolds, to stay oriented as instruction becomes more precise and more alive. Do not rush away from this threshold. Let the transition complete itself. What follows is not louder, but truer. The story does not end here. It moves forward with you, and your awareness is now part of how it continues.